Hello. Continuing the reviews of books about wartime special operations. And today I'm going to review a book. It's more of a booklet, really, which covers a very important aspect, or it's important to some of us, which is about the training of the agents. And most of the histories and a couple of the books we've reviewed previously in this series do cover the training to some extent, but most of the historians don't really go into any kind of depth on the training and the personalities and the syllabus and so on. And of course, this is of interest to quite a few people. Anyway, the book I'm going to talk about is Paramilitary Training in Scotland. And it's excuse me, it's put together by David M. Harrison, and it's published by the Arisaig area kind of tourist board. In a way, they do a lot of historical stuff on that area, and including three of these about SOE training. So one of the things is the importance of Scotland in the training, because the recruits were initially interviewed and went through a sort of sorting process in the home counties around the London area. But then for the paramilitary training, they were sent up to Scotland. And the reason Scotland was chosen was it was secluded. It had the vast training areas that could be used for rural operations and for toughening up the recruits. There were pretty decent road and rail links to the area. And importantly, one of the early training schools had already been established up there. And then, as the book points out, when General Gubbins became the training officer of SOE, he had lots of connections in Scotland. And there were a lot of castles and manor houses and estates that were requisitioned for wartime use, and they made the whole area a special security zone, and this is all mentioned in the book. So one of the interesting things that I found was that a lot of the books, even the ones that talk about the training, they talk about it from the recruits or the instructor's point of view. In this book, you find out some of the impact that it had on the local area. Accidents were common. For example, the pier at Swordland was half destroyed when too much explosive was used. A bridge to the north of Loch Mora was blown up by mistake. Limpet mines were attached to the wrong boats, and a party of Czechs nearly destroyed the rail track to Fort William. A children's party at Meoble featured a firework display with death fuse wrapped around trees and tracer bullets ricocheting from rock to rock. So, also, local civilians were often employed by the SOE, having signed the Official Secrets Act, and particularly people that employed in gamekeeping and things like that. They were recruited to teach stalking and camouflage skills. Now, a section included in the book is this, which is the origin and early history of the SOE trading section, written by Major GM40 in September 1945. Now, this is solid gold stuff. It was written to show how SOE trained its people as it was being wound up. And he talks about how SOE, as we've talked about before, came from Section D of SIS and MIR. And MIR, Military Intelligence Research, had their own establishment up in Scotland. It was called the MI wing of MIR, if you can follow. And this was RSA. And SOE took this over. So RSA House became the prime training centre for a lot of the activities, but they took a lot of other property in the area. And then you also had the finishing school at Bewley down south, which we will be talking about in a separate book. So it goes into the types of training that were done, the weapons training, physical training, appreciations, orders, DEMS training, and so on. There's a chart of a syllabus from one of the centres, one of the schools. Then there's another section written by the security officer. He was one of the instructors, Major Angus Fife. He was the Chief Security Liaison Officer of RSA and Aviemore Special Training Schools. And he talks about, he says there's sometimes confusion about STC, Special Training Centre. STC at Loch Aylort had been established in 1940, and this was established basically by the people who set up the commandos, Lord Lovat, and so on. And Fairbairn and Sykes actually taught there initially, and it was quite separate from the SOE over at RSA, and this was training special personnel because of the early formation of the commandos, but it was in a separate thing. But they did have their own syllabus and weapons training and so on. But another thing that Major Fife did was set up the cooler at Inverleigh, which he goes into in great detail about it, how he got it, and why it was used. There's a fictional book that I reviewed called The Cooler, and it more or less tells you the story, although it has been fictionalized. So another section of the book which is of interest is some of the lists of the schools. This is the Czechoslovakian section and so on. And then there's a trainer's recollections written by Lieutenant Colonel E.H. Van Marek. He was a training officer at RSA, and he goes over. He'd previously been at Loch Aylort, and he goes over the various personalities, Colonel Evans, James Young, and so on, and also Fairbairn and Sykes, who he trained with. The whole. Also, there's a section which is taken from Knights of the Floating Silk by George Langland. Now, I've always found this interesting because he describes his training, and he describes being trained by a Japanese close combat instructor, and by someone else who don't resemble anyone that anybody else can authenticate. It seems to me that it was completely a fictionalized account, although he was an agent and did parachute into France and so on. So I think there was a bit of poetic license or maybe they didn't want to reveal personalities, but they certainly didn't employ a Japanese instructor to train the SOE. And Fairbairn and Sykes were not Japanese, for example. So I always found that interesting. It's a question I've never had answered, and I would be interested to find out why he did that. Anyway, really nice book. It does fill in a lot of blanks, and there's a lot of first person experience in there, and the inclusion of the section by Major 40 is particularly interesting, and it also shows how everything was woven together from the early days and where STC fitted in and so on. So I found it very, very useful in understanding the training of SOE.